All right. Employee enablement. Paul, why aren't employees enabled after so much active enablement?
It's a lot of enablement you got going on there.
It's our big word
Well,
today.
it is a big word, and I guess let's start with what even people mean by that, because is it training, is it learning and development? What exactly is it? And for most people, you can think of employee enablement as the sort of like overarching category of how employees are able to perform their functions. And so some of that comes from experience, some of that comes from coaching and managing and so on, and some of it does come from learning and development. But regardless, um, the term and the practice is actually really centered around a bunch of really, I would say, outdated
Hmm.
functions. The enablement frameworks, they often come from the 80s and 90s. Their origins are in the military and in enterprise practices and management frameworks and all that kind of stuff that date back a long time.
Hmm.
And there's a bunch of tradition that is associated with how it's done, and that tradition is filters over into how learning and development programs are built, and how the teams that are responsible for enablement are structured. And so the lack of update to that, to those things, everything about how we work, as we've talked about so many times on this podcast, everything about how we work has changed massively since that period of the 80s and 90s. So it's kind of weird that we would use these old frameworks and these old methods when it comes
Yeah.
to one of the most critical things, enabling your employees.
Yeah. And it strikes me that it might still work for some things,
Mm-hmm.
but not for, modern knowledge worker in the modern era with the technology and the way things are. It and we've never really shifted it. That's really fascinating. I didn't think about that, but yeah,
Yeah,
that's
you're right. I think that's a really good point you make there. Actually, it can work for some things. So I'll give you an example. So if you do a job where that job itself isn't really any different to what that job was maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right, and what you do on a day to day basis isn't really that different,
yeah.
and even how you do it isn't really that different, then yeah, traditional forms of enablement work. But most organizations aren't like that anymore, right?
Hmm.
Organizations are rapidly changing. They are unstructured, ambiguous environments that are continuously morphing, right?
Yeah.
And so if that's happening, then spending X amount of time with employees, getting them ready to do their job. If it takes too long, by the time in quotes they're ready, the job itself has changed,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
what we need is something that deals with the reality of constant change.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because if you put them in the position where the only enablement they're getting is actually not right sized or correctly packaged to deliver, they're probably not going to perform very well anyway, despite the training and enablement. And it's just like, well, we gave you the training course, remember? you know?
Yeah, we gave you the training course. Remember, it reminds me. It's something you and I have talked about before. Like this whole idea of when you try to really, really tightly define what it is that people do, and then you try to build your training programs around that, then it can work great if you've got a really clear hold of what people
Hmm.
do. But if you don't, and if the thing itself is changing, then building training around, in quotes, exactly what people are supposed to do isn't going to be very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And you you have studied so much of these different types of like learning techniques and what works and what doesn't. It's pretty clear that everybody kind of learns in a different way in the spectrum in each one of those too,
Yeah.
right? So the expectation that you could create one way to train a large group of people and that would work is sort of a failure from the get-go.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly that's one aspect of it, and really, Matt, it's one aspect of many. I mean, I think the other thing that we have to really consider is the fact that not only are the work environments changing, but also the nature of the ecosystem in which these
Mm,
things exist is also changing. Right, the old school view of the world was you had companies, and then companies had customers, and maybe companies had partners. And so the way you got everybody in quotes ready was you'd start by training your employees. And once you trained your employees up, then you could use that as a means of training your partners. And once they were all skilled up,
hmm
you could then have a really clear understanding of how you were going to communicate with your customers. And also, we were always thinking of the company and the customer is almost adversarial, right?
mm,
We need to know more than our customers do because that information gap we can leverage to sell to them more effectively and things
mm,
like that. Well, that's been outdated for years,
yeah.
right? What you really need to do is you need to develop an overall view of the ecosystem that includes every aspect of your company, includes your partners, includes your customers, and give all of the aspects of the ecosystem a view of the big picture and their role in that big picture. And you need to do so in a way that makes every part of that ecosystem highly adaptable and highly resilient so that they can change as those environments change.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge shift.
It is. It's an enormous shift. And I think it actually has massive ramifications, Matt. I think it changes the way in which the enablement function is structured inside our organizations. We need to move
Mm,
away from the idea of oh, it's inside learning and development, or it's inside a particular department, even, right? It needs to be fully interconnected. We actually make an argument in a paper that we've just written about this that there needs to be a new role called the chief readiness officer, and that chief readiness officers does span that full ecosystem, not just
yeah.
inside, not just one part of it.
Yeah. And you got to come at it from both directions too, right? Because both systems are kind of missing each other.
Mm,
And by that I mean the employees are used to getting enabled in this
yes,
manner. Some of them might kind of like it. Like, where's the training for this? Where's the paper I can read to know how to do this thing? Otherwise, I don't know what to do, because
yeah,
that's how they've always been trained. So it's like, well, if I don't have that, now I'm freewheeling. How are you going to
yeah.
judge me? How are you going to rate me? If I can't check the boxes. And in some functions, most functions, uh, it's hard to really pin that down in a lot of areas, right?
Well, this comes back to themes that we've been talking about a lot on this podcast, right? I mean, really, when it comes down to it, what you need is to develop a workforce when it comes to the workforce, but also your partners as well. You
Yeah.
need to develop a workforce that is hugely adaptable, hugely resilient, and where they can take ownership. They have the skills to take ownership of their development journey, right? And that means
hmm
they've got that high level of adaptability and that high level of resilience, and they have the ability to be able to understand ways in which they can learn. Sometimes they're going to be drawing on programming that you provide for them, and then oftentimes they're going to be finding their own opportunity to learn experientially, to do a learn then do as we talk about it, but also then the learn from do, right? Whereby it's a form of reflective learning. You're doing something, you're realizing where you screwed up, we did well, we did not so well, and you're using that to continue to grow. That's a mind shift change, and it is a um, it's a shift in mindset and it's a shift in skill set as well, I would say.
Yeah. For the leaders and the employees.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Good stuff. All right, Paul.
All right,
See you
thank
next
you.
time.
See ya.